Hello, everyone. Thank you for everyone being here today. My name is Brian Swancutt. I'm chair of Our Revolution Minnesota. And joining us today, we have various members from also on the board of Our Revolution Minnesota, Wolf-PAC Minnesota, and Wolf-PAC National. You'll get to meet them very soon when they give their presentations. Today, we will be talking about our campaign finance reform, how that fits in with Our Revolution Minnesota's mission, and what Wolf-PAC Minnesota and Wolf-PAC National are doing to advance the cause of campaign finance reform, namely the way that they are taking, the direction that they're taking, which is the Article 5 convention. They're here to explain why an Article 5 convention is the best route to take. And like I said, we'll get to that later in the agenda. But like I said, thank you for being here. It's a Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I know I had a long week before getting here, so we're very glad that you're here. Just give me 1 second. Something's going on with my computer. Okay, figured it out. Our Revolution Minnesota, we are a small volunteer-driven organization. Our board of directors is entirely volunteer, and we rely on the support of volunteers to get our work done. Just want to do a little plug to please consider donating to ORMN today. Just go to our website and click the donate button. Somebody can drop a link to our website in the chat. A donation of $27 will give you the privileges to vote for new board members when it comes for our annual convention, which will be in January 2022. If you'd like to consider volunteering, if you volunteer 4 times a year in a calendar year, you can also vote at the annual meeting. We do appreciate everyone who donates and volunteers for our organization. Just a quick overview of the agenda. From Our Revolution Minnesota today, I'll be talking about what our mission is and how campaign finance reform fits in. We'll then have Carla Sands, our vice chair for the organization, talk about healthcare cost reform. And then we'll move into the Wolf-PAC presentations. First thing that they'll talk about is the challenge in Wolf-PAC's goals, report from Wolf-PAC National, Wolf-PAC legislative work in Minnesota, and the Article 5 explanation in Q&A. We'll leave time for questions after each speaker finishes. Please put your questions in the chat, whether that's on Facebook or in the Zoom chat. We have people that are monitoring both of these chats, and we'll be able, if it's on Facebook, we'll be able to relay that to our presenters, so don't worry about that. And I think that's all I have for our housekeeping items. And we'll move in. I do not have slides to present, but I will show you the Our Revolution Minnesota website. If Lily, you could stop screen sharing so I can share my screen.
Okay, I shall do that.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Let's see here. So Our Revolution Minnesota website. We do have 4 main issues that we advocate for. There's a lot of issues that we advocate for, but our 4 main ones that we chose in 2020 were ending the never-ending wars, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, and getting big money out of politics. And when we initially envisioned this, getting big money out of politics was something that we originally were going to choose just 3 issues, but we realized that getting money out of politics was an issue that connected to all of our other ones that we are really pushing for. For instance, one of the big things here in Minnesota that we are pushing for is the Minnesota Health Plan that's been proposed by Senator John Marty. We've been longtime supporters of that bill in the Minnesota Senate and in the Minnesota House when it's been introduced. As we've seen in the past here in Minnesota, and these will be some Minnesota specific examples, we may have people nationally, but here in Minnesota who are watching today. Here in Minnesota, we do have, it's been a fight to get minor healthcare reform in the state of Minnesota. I think unfortunately don't remember the name of the bill exactly. There was an insulin price reform bill that went through the legislature a couple of years ago to bring down the price of insulin, as insulin is a life-saving drug for many, many people in the state of Minnesota and across the country. And insulin has been consistently as a medication been price gouged. And the Minnesota legislature wanted to reform that to bring some control over the price of insulin, which had continued to rise. It was a hard battle to get that through the legislature here in Minnesota. Many pharmaceutical companies were not happy, especially the ones that produced insulin were not happy that that a bill was going through to try to bring down the price of insulin. And I think many other pharmaceutical companies were worried that if they're going to do that to insulin, what drug is going to come next? And how is that going to affect my bottom line? So there's a lot of advocacy against the bill. And even after the fact, I think eventually, everyone was able to come on board and, get something through that was palatable to people, to everyone. And even after the pharmaceutical industry had agreed on some of the provisions of the bill, they still turned on the bill afterwards. And that was a very small piece. That was just on insulin price reform. Obviously, the Minnesota Health Plan is a much bigger overhaul of it would be a bill that touches on all aspects of the healthcare system. And if I didn't explain before, the Minnesota Health Plan is a Medicare for all kind of bill, but specifically for the state of Minnesota. It would not be a national health plan that is being fought in Congress. That is Medicare for all. That is often the rallying cry for that. And another issue here in the state of Minnesota, I think we've all heard about it. It's become more and more of a national headline in relation to climate change, is Line 3. If you haven't heard of Line 3 yet, I'd be surprised, but Line 3 is almost built, is very much nearing completion in northern Minnesota. And has been another fight trying to stop construction altogether and to close Line 3, to shut down Line 3 altogether because of the huge impacts it would have on not just the environment and CO2 production, but on how it would affect native populations, because it does go through some waterways and some sites where wild rice is grown, and wild rice crop has been depleting for years. And if there was a leak in one of these lakes where wild rice is still able to grow, it would be catastrophic for the wild rice harvest. So there is that issue that we have been fighting for at ORMN. Many organizations across the state have been fighting for Line 3, but that has obviously been something that we have seen, especially how the police departments up there have been able to be bought by some of these huge organizations that are building Line 3, as Enbridge has been able to fund some of the police departments up there to buy them equipment in order to protect Line 3 from protesters. That's another big issue that we've seen up in northern Minnesota as it comes to that. There are other major environmental issues in Minnesota. Line 3 has taken most of the energy, but there are still copper sulfide mining sites in northern Minnesota that we've seen over the past couple of years. Those are things that we have also advocated to stop at ORMN. We were actually able a couple of years ago to meet with Attorney General Keith Ellison to talk about some of those copper sulfide mining sites, and how those would again be detrimental to a lot of Native American populations that live around the area where those sites are, and how it would affect waterways, and it would affect a lot of people, especially children, through heavy metal poisoning in the area. But those are a couple issues that our Revolution Minnesota sees as being tied intricately to campaign finance reform and to just getting money out of politics altogether. Because a lot of these big corporate pharmaceutical industry, war industrial complex, all these places, all these companies, all these organizations are able to either fund election or re-election campaigns. They're able to as we've seen with the Department of Natural Resources here, the DNR, they've been able to do takeovers of some of these state agencies in order to get permits and other things approved in order to get to speed up construction. They've been able to do all kinds of things because of the money that they're able to spend without restriction, the money that they're just to buy people, places off in order to get what they want, which is definitely in their best interest, but is not in the interest of not in the interest of the people, not in the interest of the vast majority of people who are either living here in the state of Minnesota or nationally. Like some of these issues like line 3, healthcare obviously have national impacts and affect everybody in the United States and not just here in Minnesota. But when we were conceiving these ideas, like I said, a few years ago in 2019 for the 2020 through the 2022 election cycle, these are the 3 big issues that we wanted to fight for. And the 4th one, getting money out of politics, was something that we saw as affecting the other 3 so much. They're so intertwined. All of these issues are so intertwined with money in politics that we couldn't leave money in politics out of the equation, that we had to say something about it, because we realized, and a lot of organizations are starting to realize, a lot of issue advocacy organizations like us are starting to realize just how much money is flowing into getting what these big corporations, these big corporations, to get what they want. And unfortunately, most of us, like our Revolution Minnesota and a lot of other organizations across the country, are not funded by millionaires, billionaires. We don't have a lot of money to throw around. What we do have is people power. And like we'll get to later in this presentation, Article 5 convention would tip the scales in favor of the people again, into people power being something that is able. We're still able to get things done. We have seen that over the past couple of years, or just looking back through history, that we are able to get things done, even if there is not a lot of money supporting us. But it would, campaign finance, getting money out of politics would tip the scales back in favor of the people. And that's the presentation that that's what we're hoping to communicate today, both from our Revolution Minnesota and from Wolf-PAC. But that's what I have. And next up on our agenda, we will have Carla Sand speak on healthcare cost reform on behalf of another fellow board member, Roger Kittleson, who was not able to make it today. So yeah, Carla, take it away.
Okay, this is Carla. Of course, I'm not Roger. And Roger had a specific issue that he wanted to talk about. So I'll address that very quickly and then go on to what I think our Revolution and the Healthcare for All Minnesota can work together on. But Roger has noticed down in his county that the state did give money to schools to upgrade some of their programs, to hire additional teachers to help the students come up after their COVID break, which we needed. Well, what happened is most of that money is going into healthcare costs. And what are those healthcare costs? The insurance companies have increased their premiums and they're getting a good share of that COVID money. And that seems to be a problem for all of us, all the school districts in Minnesota. So Roger's working on that. But at the same time, HCAM, Healthcare for All Minnesota, and Our Revolution belong to a coalition. And that coalition of many groups are working on the Medicare for All and also on Minnesota Health Plan. But the Healthcare for All has a project that they hope to get started. Is anyone who's familiar with their city or their county, if they would contact Healthcare for Minnesota or Our Revolution about bringing a Medicare for All resolution to their city council. All the resolution would do is get support from the city for Medicare for All. And we have a resolution already drafted that anytime you can just call and we can give you that. But we're looking for cities across Minnesota, and we already have resolutions working in Minnesota, in Mankato, in Maplewood, up in Duluth, and I think there are about 10 of them. So if you could help with that project, we really would like that. So basically, we're working to make Medicare for All the policy of the land, and Minnesota Health Plan working in Minnesota. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, for reading that on behalf of Roger, who we all wish could really be here today. He is an expert. He works in the school system. He has for a very long time, about how this money that was going to be appropriated from COVID relief funds, how most of it was eaten up by healthcare insurance companies that are providing healthcare to these school districts. And that has become a really big issue in the arena of that of municipal governments are starting more and more to realize that they can't keep up with the cost of rising healthcare every year. And that is something that, yes, you can contact Our Revolution Minnesota or Healthcare for All Minnesota about if you want to start a resolution in your city or town to put pressure on your congressional representatives or your county or your state reps as well, to make them realize that this is an issue that a lot of people care about. You should pay attention. We would definitely love to help you out. I know there has not been one introduced in Rochester. That's where I live. So if you are either watching, if you're present with us or you are in Rochester, if you see this on Facebook later, you can definitely contact me. You can contact Our Revolution Minnesota. And I would love to work with people to get one started in Rochester. That's just my little plug for that. Moving on to our next speaker. And unfortunately, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, but we'll be moving to a presentation about the challenge and Wolf-PAC's goals with Josh. Can you tell me how to pronounce your last name? I'm very sorry.
No worries. It's ACES, just like the playing cards.
ACES, okay. Who is the National Organizing Director at Wolf-PAC National? And we'll speak on the problem and challenge that we face. He'll speak about our goals and the outcome of achieving those goals. And Josh, you can take it away.
Awesome.
I'll stop sharing my screen for you.
Thank you. All right, perfect. Everybody see my screen okay? All right, perfect. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Carla, for having us here today. With everything going on in the world, it's always nice to spend a Saturday with such amazing people fighting against these corrupt power structures we all find ourselves in, and why we're all here today. So that is really the basis of Wolf-PAC. So Wolf-PAC is a nonpartisan organization. We were formed in 2011 with the goal of adding an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, specifically addressing our broken campaign finance system. Currently, we have over 50,000 volunteer signups, around 30 active teams around the country, 100 plus volunteer leaders, and many, many volunteers. We're building a bottom-up people power movement to win, to take back our representative democracy. And I was a volunteer with Wolf-PAC, and now I'm lucky enough to be able to do this full time with so many amazing people. And we have passed in 5 states: Vermont, California, Illinois, and New Jersey, and my home state of Rhode Island. Prior to working for Wolf-PAC full time, I was a volunteer on the Rhode Island team for many years, and we had the fortune of passing Wolf-PAC's resolution. And I can tell you from experience, it is one of the best feelings I've ever had in my life. And to this day, some of my closest friends in my life are folks that I worked on that issue with in the state of Rhode Island. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And there's also a really cool video at the end, which we'll get into as well. But let's talk a little bit about kind of Wolf-PAC itself, again, how we started. The name was intended to be a strong response to the aggressive tactics that we see from special interests we are fighting against, all of us. As many of you know, the founder of Wolf-PAC is Cenk Uygur, the founder of the Young Turks, one of the largest online news shows in the world. And when he announced Wolf-PAC during Occupy Wall Street, a very famous line of his here in Wolf-PAC was, from now on, they're not coming for us, we're coming for them. Typical Cenk faction. So if anybody's listening, and folks on this call too, I just wanted to stop for a moment and just ask everybody here, what are your top 3 issues you want fixed? What are the top 3 issues you care most about? And feel free to type them on Facebook if you're listening, or even here in the chat on Zoom. And if somebody can read some out if you see any. We got climate change, single-payer healthcare, ending homeless abroad. All right. Anybody else? We got ditto on all 3. Disability rights. Yeah, I mean, there is a climate change, housing equity, police. I think we would all agree that all of those issues and many more are impacted by our broken campaign finance system. So in many ways, Wolf-PAC was formed to get at the heart of what plagues this nation, the corruption that stems from the broken campaign finance system. All these issues you mentioned, the issues mentioned by Brian and Carla before me, the issues you talk about with your friends and family, all of those. Many are impacted by our broken system, and some are a result of our broken system. So that's why we must act with urgency. So we operate here at Wolf-PAC under kind of 3 pillars: urgency, and the urgency here at Wolf-PAC is everything I just mentioned, all the issues that you've mentioned. So you name the issues, and it's almost certainly being affected by the corrupting influence of money in politics. No matter what side of the political spectrum you happen to be on, it's not too late, but we must act with urgency to solve this problem so that our children do not have to deal with the consequences. And I think many of us here today and everybody listening would definitely agree with that sentiment. So how do we fix this, right? We use history as our guide. As I mentioned earlier, Wolf-PAC's goal is to add a U.S. constitutional amendment to fix this broken system, to gain freedom from corruption. And we are using a historically proven tactic, which is states calling for a limited convention. There's only 2 ways to get an amendment added to the Constitution. One is Congress, 2/3 of Congress, or 2/3 of the states can call for a limited convention and force them. So historically, this is how you get an amendment. History has shown us that there is historical precedence for using Article 5 to achieve reform. In fact, most amendments in our Constitution included a convention campaign. 4 out of the last 10 amendments included state level resolutions, just like the ones working here at Wolf-PAC. We also have the Bill of Rights because New York and Virginia called for a convention to propose those amendments. And a really good example of using this to pressure Congress is the 17th Amendment. When the states got really close to the 2/3 needed to force a convention, Congress felt the pressure of the people, and they went ahead and proposed the amendment themselves. And in a peer-reviewed report from the Congressional Research Service, they refer to this as the prodding effect. So when the American people need an amendment and Congress refuses to act, the states call for a convention. States use every power they have available. Citizens use every tool they have available. And this is how we get it done. It's undisputable that calling for a limited convention historically has pressured Congress to act. So another pillar is courage. Like the brave men and women who came before us, we lead with courage. Exercising our right to use Article 5 of the US Constitution is to respect the Constitution that we all are fighting to strengthen. And the bottom line, I'm sure we would all agree, there is emergency in this country. Corruption and special interests have taken over our Congress. We no longer have a functioning representative democracy. It seems like there's only time there's bipartisan support in Congress, unfortunately, is when it benefits wealthy donors and special interests. So we've got to fix this issue first. We've got to stand together, and we've got to use every tool of democracy to fix this issue. And we can solve this problem. We can stand together like Americans just before us, using history as our guide. We've got 27 amendments. This is done before. So I'm confident that we can get number 28. And this is how we will accomplish our shared goal sooner than later. And as I stated, if history is correct, this is how we will be successful. People power is how we will win. Amazing volunteers like many of you on this call, like Gabriel and the Wolf-PAC Minnesota team. And actually, we're going to have Gabriel be coming up next. And then after Gabriel, it's going to be Sam Fieldman, who is one of the leading experts on Article 5. He is Wolf-PAC's National Counsel, sorry. And Sam tells me that at the end of his presentation, there's going to be a really cool video, a report on Wolf-PAC, if you will, that highlights many of the state wins and the amazing volunteer work that made each one of those wins possible. So keeping on the topic of amazing volunteers, without further ado, I would like to introduce Gabriel from Wolf-PAC Minnesota.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriel from Wolf-PAC Minnesota. Thanks, Josh, for that introduction, and thank you, Brian and Carla, for speaking. Let me share my screen quick. Okay, I hope you can all see my presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabe Vatndal Vidal. For this part of the event, I would like to talk a little bit about what Wolf-PAC Minnesota has been working on for the last couple of years and where we are headed. I joined Wolf-PAC as a volunteer about 4 years ago. I wanted to help improve things because I was afraid of the impending climate crisis, but I was also living with my grandmother at the time, and seeing her struggle against the broken healthcare system in this country motivated me to finally enter the fight myself. When I first began getting involved with Wolf-PAC Minnesota, our goal was to have Wolf-PAC's free and fair elections resolution calling for an Article 5 convention pass through the Minnesota Senate. The resolution is a part of Wolf-PAC's strategy to have a 28th Amendment added to the US Constitution aimed at getting the corrupting influence of big money out of American politics. And as you may remember, Wolf-PAC, or as you may know, Wolf-PAC has passed the resolution in 5 states already, and we wanted to make Minnesota the 6th state. So we set off to get the resolution passed in the Senate. Senator Melissa Franzen of District 49 agreed to introduce the free and fair elections resolution for us, an important and necessary step in the process. But we soon met our first roadblock. Senator Mary Kiffmeyer of District 30 refused to give the resolution its first reading in the Senate, which means she could unilaterally stop the resolution from moving forward. We began canvassing her district, collecting letters, and searching for other ways to move the resolution forward. Upon finding out that we could force a vote in the Senate by passing the resolution first in the House, we began focusing our attention on the other chamber of the Minnesota Congress. At that point, I decided to do my duty as a volunteer and reach out to my representative, who at the time was Representative Zach Stephenson of District 36A. To my surprise, setting up a meeting with my representative as one of his constituents was a rather easy process. We met for lunch to discuss the resolution, and he agreed to help us. And in that lunch meeting, I actually brought my dad along, and Ryan Ratadin, who's a member or a Wolf-PAC Minnesota, and he's on this meeting as well. But Zach introduced us to his colleague, Representative Dan Walgamot of District 14B, who agreed to introduce the resolution in the Minnesota House of Representatives. Then with the resolution being introduced in the House, we needed to do some research on how the resolution would move forward. After talking to representatives and anyone who had inside information into how the Minnesota legislature worked, here's what we found on how to move a resolution through the Minnesota Congress. First, we needed to find a legislator who would introduce the resolution. Next, the resolution would be assigned to a committee. Once out of that committee, it would then get a floor vote in either the House or the Senate, depending on which chamber it started in. If successful in the first chamber, the resolution would get a vote in the other chamber, meaning if it started in the Senate, it would then go to the House and vice versa. And if it passed in both the Senate and the House, Minnesota would get added to the pile, bringing us closer to the 2/3 thresholds needed to call an Article 5 convention, which is 34 states that have to pass the resolution. So that brings us to earlier this year. We had the resolution introduced in both the Minnesota House of Representatives and the Minnesota Senate. The assigned numbers for the resolution were SF 390 and HF 429 for the Senate and the House, respectively. With our two legislative champions being the aforementioned Senator Melissa Franzen and Representative Dan Walgamot. In the Minnesota House of Representatives, the Free and Fair Elections Resolution was assigned to the Rules and Legislative Administration Committee, awaiting a hearing and a vote. Whether the resolution was to be given a hearing and a vote was still up in the air, and this was what we were focusing all of our efforts here in Minnesota on during the 2021 legislative session, securing a vote in the Rules and Legislative Administration Committee. Specifically, we needed the chair of the committee, Representative Ryan Winkler, to move it forward in this way. And as you can see, these are all the members of the Rules and Legislative Administration Committee. I have them listed out on the left by their name, their district. And on the right, I have a graphic that took me longer than I care to admit to make, with all of the representatives' pictures piled kind of behind Representative Ryan Winkler, who was the chair of the committee. And so the battle was fought. Us volunteers here in Minnesota, Wolf-PAC Minnesota, gave presentations organized with other groups. We held special events. We campaigned in farmers markets. We collected signatures. We collected video messages and practiced our testimonials for the fabled hearing and the vote on the resolution. We had an event where we screened the documentary Dark Money with American Promise. We showed up at the Capitol and we had meetings with legislators. We spent our nights making PowerPoints like this one, and we did pitch practices so we could communicate with our representatives and fellow Minnesotans more effectively. Then the pandemic hit, but that didn't stop us. We organized Zoom meetings. We held informational online Jeopardy event. The Mad Lads over at Wolf-PAC National created an email tool for people to use to contact their legislators, and we promoted that religiously. Finally, we did a 3-day-long call-in campaign where Minnesota volunteers called Representative Ryan Winkler his office for 3 days straight, every hour on the hour, urging him to put the resolution up for a vote. We did all this in our free time, wanting to improve our community and help those around us. Wolf-PAC is made up of everyday people, just regular folks who just want to change the system so it better represents the American people, not just big moneyed interests. And because we are made up of everyday people, I would like to say thank you for all your hard work. And I admire you all for dedicating your time to helping your fellow human beings. In the end, the resolution was not put up for a hearing or a vote, but that is not the end of the fight. As I have laid out, we have taken many steps forward and learned a lot about the process. Even today, we are preparing for the 2022 legislative session and adjusting our strategy using the knowledge we have gained. If you are interested in learning more and want to get involved with Wolf-PAC Minnesota, we have weekly meetings every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central Time, and we hope to see you all in the field. And on the slide, I have a link to Wolf-PAC's website, www.wolfpac.com. You can go there and you can register as a volunteer, and you'll be directed to the Minnesota team if you're in Minnesota. And if you're in any other state, you'll be directed to those state teams. And you can start volunteering. That is it for my portion of the presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for hearing me out and everyone for being here and all the other presenters. Next, it will be Sam Fieldman, who is our Article 5 expert, who will be talking on the Article 5 process and how we can use that to effectuate the change that we so desperately need in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just start my, I'm not enabled to share my screen.
Give me 1 second.
No problem. Yeah, I want to thank Gabe and everyone for inviting us here. Thank our Revolution as well. The video, by the way, that I informed Josh will be coming at the end. I informed him that I would like to steal it to put at the end of my presentation. It was originally at the end of his, so I want to thank you for that. Oh, wait, I didn't enable sound. Sorry about that. Share sound. All right. I also. There, that's the full screen version. I also want to let you know I misplaced my good microphone, so I hope you'll bear with me with this one. As you can see on screen here, the Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for the proposing amendments, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified. That's the bare bones how to amend the Constitution. But what I really want to talk to you today is the American journey of how people amend the Constitution, how it's really done in the real world. And to start that off, I'm going to go back through the history of Wolf-PAC. Josh covered a little bit of this, and it got started in my hometown of New York City. Josh told you about what motivated a lot of people, but I want you to hear it directly from Cenk.
I'm Cenk Uygur. I have an announcement. Tonight, We're going to start a fight to take back our democracy. Our politicians are bought. They can no longer buy our politicians. We want an army to fight for an amendment. In this fight, we need leaders. We need organizers. We need you. We named it Wolf-PAC because they're not coming for us. We're coming for them. There is hope. They can fight back. We will fight back. And we will win. Wolf-PAC.com.
Yeah, that's what motivated Cenk, and I don't care if you love Cenk, hate Cenk, have no idea who Cenk is. What motivates each of us to participate in this movement is something different, and you can see that in the stories. You know, Josh talked about it, Gabe talked about why they're motivated to do this. You can see that in this image here of a telephone splicing technician holding the first ever Wolf-PAC rally in New Hampshire. Today, he's the national director of Wolf-PAC. That's Mike Mineta. And as for what motivated me, well, that little one's name is Ginny.
You want to walk back?
Born about 6 weeks after Wolf-PAC was founded.
Walk back.
And that's Hannah.
Nicely done, Hannah.
You want to walk back?
All right, Sam's taking video of them right now to show you.
And the important thing when you're a part of any movement is to find your motivation, your guiding star that will carry you through a very long process. We're going to move across the country over to Montana and also move back in time to a time when money-controlled politics, corporations had a complete stranglehold on every political system. Income inequality was worse than it had ever been, a time that might be very familiar to you. But in this case, it was about 100 years ago, a little over that, 120 years ago, in the Gilded Age. At that time in Montana, the Copper Kings controlled the entire thing. They actually moved the state capital, and in the vote to do that, more people voted than there were people in Montana. And we started an American tradition, a tradition of fighting back, with people-powered campaigns that ultimately passed the Corrupt Practices Act in Montana. It passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act federally. A number of important reforms were instituted that took our political system back from the corporations and gave it to the people. Now, there was no golden age of American politics. There was never a time period where people actually got everything that should have been done. But there was a long period where when there was a real problem, we addressed it with new campaign finance reforms. And from the early 1900s through the 1970s, things did steadily improve. They never got to the point where they were great, but they were moving in the right direction until Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976, which was a precursor of Citizens United. And then Citizens United in 2010, and by 2012, we had a new American tradition. This case is called American Tradition Partnership v. Bullock. I know this seems like a very long snippet of a case, just to explain that this applied Citizens United directly to the states. It stripped out all of the logic that was behind Citizens United and just threw out 100 years of campaign finance reform. But even though it's a long piece of text to say that, it's a very short piece of text to be the entire decision of the case. This one single paragraph with no oral argument and no judge even signing the case throughout, it was a solid from 1912 to 2012, 100 years of campaign finance law in Montana, and with it, the rest of the states. So we need to learn from the voices of the past, from the voices back then that talked about how the people can actually fight back and control things. And I want to play for you, this was around the time period where legal research was first starting to be published in law journals. And I want to play for you a reenactment of a snippet from Yale Law Journal, volume number 1.
The likelihood of danger from this source is easy to overcome. Let the people act as if the convention required the best efforts from the best men, and the best men will offer themselves for the work. If the people are indifferent and unconcerned, they can expect, as in any case will happen, that the boss-favoring and corporation-favoring aspirant, throwing away all sense of honor and patriotism to his state and obligation to his constituency, will do his worst for his odious master! But granting the latter possibility for argument's sake, would anything be accomplished? Granted that the delegates would turn aside from all considerations of the social needs, could they, through the bastard power, even momentarily accomplish their corrupt object? The people, having hedged about the delegated powers with restrictive checks which the courts have adjudged to be mandatory, and likewise that their action must be submitted to the people for ratification or rejection. It is at once apparent that such a move on the part of the delegates would be futile and ill-fated. Fears of trouble from these sources are groundless.
I want to thank David Leibowitz, Wolf-PAC volunteer and professional voice actor, for the dramatic reading. I think we can probably all agree that the Yale Law Review peaked early in terms of its style. But it's important not to let the message get lost in the language here. What John Huber was saying is that in a convention process, he was talking about the state level conventions for amending the state constitutions, but the same logic applies. Whenever you have elections to elect people specifically for one issue, for amending the Constitution on one particular issue, getting the corrupting influence of money out of politics, that is a single issue election. We are much more likely to send people who are committed on that issue. And in particular, when the issue is money in politics, that also reduces the power of money being spent in that election. It makes it that much more likely that we will have the best people writing that amendment, as opposed to the people who are currently empowered to do that in Congress, who don't seem inclined to do it at all. He also pointed out, though, that even in a worst case scenario where you have the corporation favoring and the other words that he used, people elected into the convention, and they write something terrible, something that people don't want to see in the Constitution, the ratification bar is enormously high. There are several other checks on this process that we will get into, but the ultimate check by the people themselves in choosing their delegates and ultimately in the ratification process prevents anything from entering the Constitution without an enormously high bar of being ratified by 38 states. And the lesson there is the checks by the people themselves. We're going to move now down to Texas. And there's Todd Jagger. As Gabe said, it's a lot easier to get these meetings with your representatives than you might think, especially at the state level. Todd started calling early on in Wolf-PAC, one representative after another, going through an alphabetical list. And he got his meeting when he got to the B's. That representative said, "Are you from Wolf-PAC? Tell me, why do you want to save the wolves?" And Todd told him, "I don't want to save the wolves, I want to save the republic." And that representative then agreed to introduce our very first resolution in any state. First state to introduce us was Texas. We had one slight problem. We had not yet written the model resolution. So Todd called me up. Jank put me in touch with Larry Lessig and a few other people. We wrote a very good model resolution and helped each other out. And the lesson that we had to learn there was, no matter if you wait until you've planned everything out in advance, you will never get started. You will certainly never finish. And once you get started, your plan is going to blow up anyway. So it's important to have a plan, but it's also important to be able to adjust and build the plane in the air. By the time we moved up to Vermont a short while later, though, by then we did have our model resolution. We had our strategy better mapped out. We had a new executive director, and we had help from some kids in high school. We were told by Senator Ginny Lyons, remember that name. Ginny Lyons told us, she introduced our bill, but she told us it would not get a hearing. The senator, Senator Sears, was absolutely opposed to it. He didn't even want to let us into the room. We had a team calling up people in the state because, well, it's easy for someone in the state to reach their legislator. They don't really want to hear from you if you're not from their state. Walker on the left there is from Texas, and he managed to reach somebody in Vermont who was a big supporter once he heard about the cause, because this is a really popular movement. We have supporters who haven't heard about us, and we need to make sure that we get that message out. But once we reach them, they agree. And that supporter happened to know Dick Sears. He called him up and we got in the door. we got into the room where it happens. But that's only the first step. We then needed to get out of that room. Salim is one of our youngest volunteers. He's also one of our oldest volunteers. He's joined around the same time I did, right in the very early days of Wolf-PAC. And he and I got a call asking us to come up to Vermont to help out there. When we got there, I had a meeting with the Legislative Council and shared with her the research that I'd been doing on Article 5. And she did her job. She didn't take my word for it. She went back to her office. She did her own research. She looked into it, made sure that she understood what was going on. And when the meeting started, she testified. And by the time she was done, we had already won. We won before we opened the door. I didn't end up needing to testify at all in Vermont. Salim and I spent the day there talking to legislators. It's amazing to watch, especially younger people, people of all ages, but watching younger people and the energy that they put into this kind of stuff is fantastic to watch. And Mike and Ryan stayed up there for longer. They had meetings in bars and on ski slopes, and we ended up winning in Vermont. And the way we did that was by finding the gatekeepers and getting through those gates. Vermont became our very first state. Moving on down a few years later to New Jersey, Walker is now out of high school. He's still too young to join us in a bar to celebrate. He once again got us into the room where it happens. He was now our New Jersey state leader. And he got us into the hearing room, and we heard that we had an opponent coming that was particularly well known. It was the Eagle Forum. I don't know if you're aware of the Eagle Forum. Phyllis Schlafly ran that organization, and they were the main people responsible for killing the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1980s. It was a very popular amendment, but not quite popular enough once there was opposition to actually get all the way into the Constitution, because ratification is just such an enormously high bar, even for amendments that most people want. Well, I heard that Andrew Schlafly, Phyllis Schlafly's son, was going to be there. I prepared specifically to rebut what he was going to say. And when I got to the room, I whispered to Mike loud enough that he could hear me that I had done that. He actually turned around and walked out of the room. So the person you're seeing there testifying is not Andrew Schlafly. He is a member of Americans for Prosperity. And he was sent there as the lobbyist by the Koch brothers, along with the gentleman sitting next to him. It was the first time we had seen one of these big money groups coming to oppose us. But what they didn't count on was the army of volunteers who really knew their stuff and were well-versed, because they had money, but we had people. We won in New Jersey. We celebrated with Walker, not in a bar because he was only 19 or 20. But unfortunately, things didn't always go quite as well. Moving across the country to Washington, here we had an even bigger group. This is not the hearing room here. This is actually the overflow room. We got about 250 people to show up in Washington. We overflowed the overflow room, and we presented the research at the hearing. What we didn't really do, there was one op-ed that was written by a law scholar, a constitutional law scholar, but he wasn't a scholar of the Article 5 Convention. He was generous enough to share with me the research process he did. And when he emailed the law librarian, he didn't even know if anybody had ever done any research on the Article 5 Convention. He hadn't read the textbooks that date back to literally the very first textbook on American law in the 1790s, through the treatises of the 1800s by Joseph Story and Jameson, by James Madison, all the way up through the plethora of research that was done through the 19th and 20th century. But what he did here was this quote.
I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa. Who knows what would come out of that?
Now, if you hear a quote that short, there's a really good chance it's taken out of context. Let me tell you what Scalia's actual views are, and I'll let him tell you himself.
Just as it's possible that the Congress tomorrow might pass a law abolishing Social Security as of the next day, or eliminating Christmas. Sure, such things are possible, remotely possible. I don't have any fear that such proposals as extreme as he's talking about would come out of the Constitutional Convention. What's the alternative? The alternative is continuing with a system that provides no means of obtaining a constitutional amendment except through the kindness of the Congress, which has demonstrated that it does not want to have any other way to get a constitutional amendment. If the only way to remove us from utter bondage to the Congress is to take what I think to be a minimal risk on this limited convention, then let's take it. But the fact remains that there is a widespread, deep feeling of powerlessness in the country. One sees it on every side with respect to many issues, not just the budget issues. The people do not feel that their wishes are observed. They're heard, but they're not observed, particularly at the federal level. The basic problem is simply that the Congress has become professionalized. It has an interest much higher than ever existed before in remaining in office. It has a bureaucracy that is serving it. It is much more subject to the power of individualized pressure groups as opposed to the unorganized feelings of the majority of the citizens. All of these reasons have created this feeling, which is real and which I think has a proper basis, of powerlessness. One remedy for that, the one specifically provided in the Constitution, is this amendment process which bypasses the Congress. I would like to see that amendment process used just once at first. I don't much care what it's used for the first time. I think just having it used once will exert an enormous influence upon both the Congress and the Supreme Court.
In fairness, I don't think he was anticipating it being used to overturn decisions in which he was in the majority. The irony is not lost on me that Scalia would very much have disagreed about the purpose of this particular effort, even though he very much supported the process. And I don't care if you agree with absolutely nothing else Scalia says. There are certainly many times where I do not agree with Antonin Scalia. But when people are trying to claim that he opposed the Article 5 Convention, it's flat out not true. You will notice one thing that was not included in this video, though. This is from 1979. That little snippet I showed you was from 2014. So you might be wondering, well, maybe he changed his mind in the time in between. No, I'm going to play for you the full context of that quote from 2014, so there's no doubt in your mind that anybody using that quote to say Scalia opposed the Article 5 Convention is misinformed.
If you could amend the Constitution in one way, what would it be and why? Justice Scalia.
I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa. Who knows what would come out of that? But if there were a targeted amendment that were adopted by the states, I think the only provision I would amend is the amendment provision. I figured out at one time what percentage of the populace could prevent an amendment to the Constitution. And if you take a bare majority in the smallest states by population, I think something less than 2% of the people can prevent a constitutional amendment. It ought to be hard, but it shouldn't be that hard.
We're not talking about the Article 5 Convention there. That was mentioned nowhere in the entire broadcast that this clip is from. He was talking about he doesn't want a convention like in Philadelphia that totally rewrites the Constitution. We know from his extensive remarks in 1979 that he very well understood the difference between that and a limited Article 5 convention, which he was in favor of. So trying to claim that this was somehow Scalia's subtle way of changing his mind and indicating that over time, well, Antonin Scalia has been accused of many things, but subtlety was never one of them. What he was saying here, and it's exactly the same thing that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's sitting next to him, said immediately afterwards, the amendment process is so difficult. Not only do we not have to worry about amendments we don't want getting through, it takes an enormous Herculean effort to get through amendments that we do want through. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked about the Equal Rights Amendment as her example, as one that was very popular and still didn't make it through the process. This argument is the exact same one that was used by John Hoover in 1891. But unfortunately, none of that got through to the state legislature. It's very difficult, much more than you would expect, for people to distinguish between an op-ed and actual legitimate research. And it's the level of research that's done for an op-ed, even by somebody who is a scholar in another topic, is not anywhere close to the same as what's done for peer-reviewed legal research. But it's really hard for a lot of people to distinguish between those two, so they ultimately let the legislative session end without a vote. So even though we have people, they have money. In this case, money, connections, influence, the ability to place op-eds that are going to get read, and that was a problem there. So how do we deal with that? Well, we deal with that, first of all, by learning about the history of this process. And that takes us back not only across the country again, but also back in time. The first thing that's important to remember is the convention in Philadelphia that wrote the Constitution was not an Article 5 convention. Article 5 had not yet been written. There was no convention process. There wasn't even a convention process in the Articles of Confederation. It was an informal meeting that had no power except to propose. They proposed, among the rest of the Constitution, 3 different convention processes. One is the Article 5 proposing convention that we're talking about. Another we'll get to later. And then also here, the Article 7 conventions to ratify the Constitution. And that's what actually gave the Constitution its power. No state was bound by the Constitution unless they actually ratified it and agreed that they would pull out of the Articles of Confederation, which were just a treaty that they were free to pull out of any time, and agree that they would join this new experiment once 9 states had all agreed to do so. Well, in New Hampshire, the Federalists controlled the state government, but the people of New Hampshire were widely anti-Federalist. And they knew this, so they did everything they could to rig the process. And that's a great thing about conventions. As we see in New Hampshire, you can't really rig them. They held it in Federalist-controlled Exeter in the middle of a really harsh New Hampshire winter. And it's not like they could get in their SUV and drive down. They were going either on foot or, if they were lucky, on horseback and wagon. But at the time when the information superhighway was the Pony Express, this was really big news. And so people instructed their delegates to how they wanted them to vote and sent them down to Exeter. And they told them to vote no. They told them to vote no. When they got to Exeter, the delegates, a lot of them realized that their instructions were wrong. The Constitution was actually a good thing, and they wanted to vote yes, but they couldn't because they were bound by their instructions. They actually sent everybody home from the Exeter Convention to go back and get new instructions. And that's best illustrated by a microcosm of the whole process, a small town of Boscawen. We have records from about half the towns, but this one makes a good microcosm of the whole example. The delegate there was persuaded that the right thing to do was to vote for the Constitution. He went back and told the people, I know that your opinion is that the Constitution's a bad thing, but if you send me back, I'm going to vote for it. I'm going to be a runaway delegate. The people of Boscawen recognized an inherent power that they had, which was to remove him from office and replace him with another delegate who would vote the way they wanted. They had another delegate all lined up. And when it came time to decide, should we enforce our inherent power over this delegate by replacing him with someone who will follow our instructions, or should we allow him to vote his conscience, even though we may be a little skeptical? They decided to let him go back, let him vote his conscience. There were enough delegates there who had had new instructions who would change to allow them to change their views, that New Hampshire passed, became the 9th state, and put the Constitution into effect. Now, Alexander Hamilton had a Pony Express rider waiting there in New Hampshire to race down to New York with news of this very first, of this 9th state that actually put the Constitution into effect. And he did that. He had a Pony Express rider come to the New York Convention in Poughkeepsie. The reason he did that was it completely changed the landscape. Now that the Constitution was going into effect, they had a brand new tool. Article 5 was now law. The Article 5 Convention was now an option, and that helped resolve the fights that they were having in New York. John Jay, who became the first Supreme Court Justice of the United States, Chief Justice of the United States, he wrote a letter that was signed unanimously by the New York Convention, calling for the use of the Article 5 Convention, and he called for it specifically for the limited purpose of proposing amendments that had been proposed by the various states in their Article 7 conventions. That was then passed by New York and Virginia, who became the first two states to call for an Article 5 convention limited to that purpose. And that was an important part of the political pressure that was put on James Madison, who didn't want amendments so early on, and forced him to propose the Bill of Rights. So, not bad for the first time out. And that shows a check by the states, both because the constituents of a convention control their delegates, and also, in the case of the Article 5 proposing convention, the constituents are the states. And it also shows the ability of the states to use their ability to call an Article 5 convention as a check over a runaway Congress, runaway Supreme Court, runaway government. So we're jumping forward back in time, back to the Gilded Age, when at this point in time, senators were elected by the House and Senate of the state, by the state legislature. It was a system so notorious for bribery and corruption that they called the U.S. Senate the Millionaires Club. Of course, now we call a millionaire and Senate poor. But Oregon had a plan, and the Oregon plan, as it came to be known, was to have a non-binding resolution that would declare who the people thought the senator should be, and that would influence the legislators. Now, a representative inherently cannot be instructed. If you look it up in Black's Law Dictionary, you'll see a definition of instructed delegate. You will not see a definition of instructed representative. Those resolutions were non-binding, but they were very influential. And a number of states adopted that practice, and it started slowly to change the makeup of who was in the Senate. At the same time, the state of Nebraska had a different strategy. They called for the first Article 5 convention on the issue of direct election of senators in 1893. But Nebraska kind of did it on their own. What was actually much more influential was the state of Pennsylvania, who actually built a coalition. A coalition of legislators in Pennsylvania coordinated with legislators around the country in 1901, and that really got the process kicked off and got the ball rolling on what would be an enormously successful Article 5 convention effort that got within a couple of states of getting to the convention before, together with the other activism that was being done, the Oregon Plan and many other things, the Senate decided it didn't want to get shown up and have the process taken away from them. So instead, they called for the convention themselves. Or no, they called for the amendment themselves, rather. And that system of activists working together, building a coalition, using different strategies, building different pieces of the puzzle, but helping each other out and not getting in each other's way, that's how you turn a fight that's impossible into one that's inevitable. And that's what we need to do here. Jumping forward now another 20 years I remember I said there were 3 kinds of conventions under the US Constitution. The third one is the Article 5 ratifying convention. 26 of our amendments have been ratified by the state legislatures. But in 1933, for the first time in 150 years, the United States called for conventions under Article 5 of the Constitution. Don't let anybody tell you we've never done that before. We haven't used this particular provision of calling an amendatory convention, but we had dozens of Article 5 ratifying conventions, and people were nervous because this was a provision of the Constitution calling for conventions that we had never used. Turned out, even though we hadn't used this particular type of convention, we knew how conventions work in general. By that time, we had already had over 200 conventions at the state level to amend state level constitutions. We knew how that process worked. And that photograph that you're seeing there is the ratification convention in Utah that put us over the top to actually ratify the 21st Amendment and repeal prohibition. But the background you're seeing is Arizona. And the reason is Arizona had a particularly interesting law that seemed like it was inspired by Boscawen, New Hampshire, where they said that if a delegate runs away from the binding instructions that Arizona placed on it, that delegate's vote would be invalidated, they would be removed, and they would be replaced with an alternate delegate. Just last year in 2020, a unanimous decision, even from this divided Supreme Court, a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court upheld that exact scheme for the Electoral College. So we've seen courts being willing to get involved to uphold the state's ability to control their delegates in federal conventions like this. And they specifically looked at history in doing that. And this history is enormously powerful as a piece of precedent. It's not the only precedent we have, though, not the only time that we've seen courts getting involved. In Florida in 2008, they held a limited purpose convention to propose amendments to the state constitution of Florida, limited to budget issues. And there were some reasonable disagreements about what did and did not count as a budget issue. It ultimately went to the courts. The case was called Ford v. Browning in 2008, and the court let some amendments get ratified and held others back. In a case very analogous to Article 5, the court upheld the limitations that were in place. And so that we see, we've seen court cases from 1798 through 2020 about this, and we see the checks by the courts from this enormous amount of precedent. Now jumping back across the country one more time, in 1979 now, there was the Balanced Budget Amendment. That effort kind of peaked at that point. They were trying to use the Article 5 convention process for that. At the time, the Balanced Budget Amendment was not seen nearly in as much of a partisan light as it is seen today. But there was one very prominent opponent, law professor Larry Tribe, who came out to California and testified against it. And a lot you would see, and I'm going to get into why, you would see over the years his words being used to try to claim that he opposed ever having a convention. Well, he was asked about that in 2011, and this was his answer.
Now, does that lead me to think we should never have another Article 5 convention? No, I agree very much with Nick. There's a first time for everything. And I do believe that there may be certain kinds of systemic breakdowns where a large majority of the people of the United States want something to happen. For example, and I take this just as an example, they want to limit the ability of amassed corporate wealth to dominate American politics. But it may be the case that the very things that make us want to change the influence of corporate money on politics will make it essentially inconceivable that Congress would propose that amendment to the states. Now, if we get that kind of lockdown, then I think we're at least in the territory where there's perhaps a plausible systemic case for a limited purpose convention, assuming enough people can be convinced that it could be limited. I would also object very much to someone who said that because I don't know the answers to all of the questions about an Article 5 convention, I would oppose ever having one. And that's why I've made very clear that I don't take that view.
So how did we get from this place where Professor Tribe is very much opposed to an Article 5 convention for the Balanced Budget Amendment? He's also very much opposed to the Balanced Budget Amendment on policy. And he has some open questions that he doesn't know about the process because it's not a process that, quite frankly, he's ever really studied or published on. His testimony from 1979 got published, but that's not the same thing as a rigorous academic article. Well, it started with then and future Governor Jerry Brown of California. In 1979, he was just coming off of a big loss in a political fight, and he was gearing up to challenge sitting President Jimmy Carter for the Democratic primary. And he came out in support of the Balanced Budget Amendment Article 5 convention effort. And Democrats on the other side of the country absolutely freaked out. Over to Washington. There were a lot of meetings at Camp David in Washington, D.C., New York City, Boston, that that I've seen some reporting on. The one that I have, but there's one particular discussion where I actually have a memo that was written from this time. Staffers in Senator Birchbuy's office were trying to figure out what to do in response to Governor Jerry Brown coming out in support of the balanced budget amendment. And they came up with 6 possibilities. 1, hold a hearing with the aim of demonstrating the risks of calling a convention. Now, this office was responsible for the subcommittee on the Constitution in the United States Senate. And in November of that year, they did in fact hold that hearing. Another one was try to coordinate a behind the scenes campaign to quell state legislatures from urging Congress to call a convention. The first organization to officially get started with that started just a few weeks later in Massachusetts. A couple of years later, the chief of staff from this office left the Senate and began to lead the group Citizens to Protect the Constitution. And with that group, they very much did number 6, which was Scream. Now you probably never, I can't believe they actually wrote that into the memo. I refer to this as the Scream memo because like, why would you write that? But and there's a lot of memos that you can find in National Archives. It's very hard to find anything on this organization on Google because almost all of their work was sending letters behind the scenes. So you can find those letters in National Archives all over the country. There's only a couple of interviews and they're from very obscure sources where they actually talked about what they were doing. And I think only one publication that I found. But they, among others and other groups that they worked together with, took things like Lawrence Tribe's statement and statements from other scholars and anything that they could twist into opposition to Article 5 rather than the process, rather than the policy. That's what they did. And they did that mainly because the balanced budget amendment at that time was a pretty popular policy. It isn't anymore. It doesn't have nearly the popularity it had then. It's still more than 50%, but it doesn't have anywhere close to the popularity to get into the Constitution. But at the time, they went with the politically expedient route and started spreading this false information. Now that hearing, though, that they had in November, it was just because that was the reason they wanted to call it doesn't mean the hearing itself was a sham. That hearing was called to discuss the ability of Congress to put a check on this process. And there have been a number of bills put forth by Congress to do just that. At that hearing, they heard testimony from John Feerick, who was the spokesperson for the American Bar Association Commission that spent 2 years studying this process, put together a 100-page report that you can find online and at wolf-pac.com/resources, and went through the safety of the process, the history of the process, what Congress can do about the process, and a number of bills that have been introduced over the years to do just that. And surprisingly, they've all, from Congress, they've all been pretty uncontroversial, whether they were introduced by Orrin Hatch or a young congressman in the 1980s that you might have heard of, Chuck Schumer. So we're going to go back to modern day now and look at putting these lessons into practice. That's Allison Hartson. She was a young teacher from California, a high school teacher when she volunteered for Wolf-PAC, helped us pass in that state, and that is not what I'm going to talk about. She went on to lead Wolf-PAC for a few years and then left to run for the Senate, and then she moved to Hawaii and is now leading the TYT Army in Hawaii. But when she was with Wolf-PAC, she went to Hawaii for a different reason. And when she was there, she encountered gatekeepers of another level. There we saw the Attorney General's office in Hawaii issue a report that actually used those talking points from op-eds. They actually cited an op-ed in one of in their testimony one year. And when they did cite peer-reviewed work, when they cited a report from the Attorney General's office, that report was using the statement that they quoted and then explaining why that statement was wrong. It was the exact opposite of what they were saying. So you always have to check your sources. This false information has been in the zeitgeist now for such a long time that reputable people hear this stuff from reputable places that seem like viable sources, and those people heard it from reputable places as well, that you really have to carefully trace back the research and make sure that you're getting sources from peer-reviewed articles that understand what they're doing in order to do the research properly. Fortunately, that's exactly what Tim Vanderveer did. Tim Vanderveer was the head of the Hawaii State Party, well, I'll let him tell you the story of what happened next.
Tim Vanderveer, once again, testifying in support as an individual, not in my capacity as chair of the Democratic Party, though. I actually testified in opposition to this resolution last year and have been sufficiently persuaded in the interim after reading the legal reports and understanding the jurisprudence and really the intent of the framers, I think, in holding a limited convention just for that constitutional amendment. And I would note that someone noted that there hasn't been a constitutional convention, an Article 5 convention in the past 200 years, but someone else also noted that we've come very, very close. And I think that's really the point of this whole thing. It's not just an effort in holding this convention, but it's also putting pressure on Congress. Nothing has been done. And this is an exercise in organizing. And I believe, after reading the opinion of legal experts and also members of our courts, that this can be limited, and also firmly believe that when the people lead, our leaders will follow.
Not alone there. We saw something similar happen just a couple of years ago in Oregon, where the legislative council there initially was opposed, and then we didn't even speak to him. He did the research entirely on his own, came back and testified a couple of years later and said he had been wrong, and gave a wonderful explanation of exactly why he had been wrong. And I have a ton of respect for that. I also absolutely love Hawaii. It's the only state in the union where if you testify in a suit, you're not taken seriously. You have to be wearing a Hawaiian shirt if you want them to take you seriously, and that is fantastic. Now, Tim was not controlled by anybody else, and that really helped. And the persistence really matters here. But sometimes persistence is not enough, because sometimes people aren't so free to change their minds. So let's look at West Virginia. Now, normally in West Virginia, who did the answer to? The answer is nobody.
So we got these guys. There's this guy, Richard Saffel, in West Virginia. He's known as Wolf-PAC Saffel because he's always in the state house. You know, some of these folks, they drive 3-4 hours each way to go to the state houses, okay? Not in West Virginia, but in the bigger states like Montana, et cetera, right? And he has 3 jobs. He's a regular guy. He works at a restaurant. I think when I met him, he was working at IHOP, right? But all the state senators and all the state reps know Wolf-PAC Saffel because he's in the state house all the time. He's like, I'm a citizen. I get to ask for change, right? I get to take action. I love that. There's so much I love about West Virginia, by the way.
And right there in the middle is Wolf-PAC Saffel, sitting between me and Eli from the ACLU. This was a debate held by Indivisible in West Virginia, with West Virginia, Kentucky, and Illinois. And the issue with the ACLU, as their national legislative director has said several times in interviews, he personally, and many of the lawyers and people who study this stuff in the ACLU, Eli included, are opposed to the Citizens United decision and the related rulings. But they are responsive to their members who are anonymous, they're anonymous donors, much like many other organizations are. And their donors are insisting that their position be to support Citizens United. They actually wrote a brief in support of it when the case was initially before the Supreme Court. And Eli told me after this debate that the only research that he had done was actually reading our website, and he told me that that was more research than he did before he testified on the issue. But he has the ACLU name behind him, and that's a great organization in so many other ways that people trust them inherently. He also told me that he's employed by the ACLU, so it doesn't really matter if he changes his mind on the Article 5 convention. He told me this by email. He's going to do his job, and his job is to oppose the Article 5 convention. And because there's so much goodwill behind that organization, it's believed. So what we really need to do is educate people. In some cases, there's people like this case of Oregon or Hawaii, where we can educate people to change their mind. In other cases, we have to educate people about the hands that are tying people's, the ropes that are tying people's hands that are preventing them from changing their minds, even if they should. And we're almost done now. Wyoming, that on the left there is Ken Chestek. He's a law professor from Wyoming, and this group is Wyoming Promise. They are a close ally with American Promise as well as with Wolf-PAC. And Ken had an idea for another path that used a Supreme Court case called Arizona redistricting. And he looked at that case and realized that there might be a possible avenue to argue that it was legal to use the Article 5 Convention through a referendum. It's probably not. Most of the law says no, but there's a reasonable argument there. He also knew that Wyoming has a very difficult referendum process. So he had a couple of things going against him, and he and the people working with him knew, even with support from Senator Alan Simpson and many other prominent people from Wyoming, that they were unlikely to succeed at that plan. So they planned to fail in a way that was still planning to succeed. They did everything they could to get the referendum, but they knew that if they failed to do that, that work they had done would still help them in the state legislature. And that kind of planning shows diversification, which really matters. We saw a similar diversification of tactics in what is now my hometown. I grew up in New York, but I've lived in Massachusetts now for the last 7 years. And in Massachusetts, we call our local resolution the We the People Act. It's named after a local group that we work closely with. And American Promise is also based in Massachusetts. Worked really hard, and we helped them out, as did We the People, to set up the Massachusetts Citizens Commission. That group was formed to study the process and make recommendations about how to end the corrupting influence of money in politics. The Citizens Commission, we helped them get testimony. They heard from opponents, they heard from supporters, they heard from experts all over the country, and they heard from one senator from the great state of Vermont named Ginny Lyons, and here's what she had to say.
So at that time, we after meeting with Lawrence Lessig, we drafted another resolution, JRS 27, and we had strong support in the Senate. I have to say, it wasn't easy to draft a resolution asking for a constitutional amendment. It was with fear and trepidation that I personally went in that direction because I was unfamiliar with the process. And I think that many of the people in the room with whom I was working, citizens, were also unfamiliar and not certain what the outcome would be. So we educated ourselves about the process. And as the resolution was passed, one of the best things that happened to us in that process was that we became aware of the Wolf-PAC, and they helped us understand the importance of educating the public about what Article 5 actually means.
So in 2020, the Massachusetts Citizens Commission issued their final report, and that report unanimously recommended a broad range of strategies. Included among them were the Article 5 Convention. They also recommended outreach and activism, and they also recommended pushing to go through Congress. As we've seen, these pushes that have been very successful, like for the Bill of Rights, like for the 17th Amendment, ultimately what they succeeded in doing was prodding Congress. That's fine. That's much more likely than actually getting to the point of a convention, and that would be great. Our goal is the solution to the problem of the corrupting influence of money in politics. Pushing for this strategy is Wolf-PAC's role in getting that done. Now, that report from 2020 looks like it's actually going to be adopted by the Massachusetts Democrats. I'll know that in probably a couple of days as part of their platform, and we have a hearing coming up in probably about next month to try to get the We the People Act passed one more time. And I just want to recap real quick the lessons that we've learned in this travel around the country. You know, when you're building a movement, you've got to be able to build the plane in the air. You've got to find all the gatekeepers. There's the fight between money and people. You need the coalition. On the execution, persistence, education, diversification, and research all matter. On the path, on this path in particular, you know, I don't care if you don't trust the people. I don't care if you don't trust the states, courts, or Congress. What I trust is the system working together, this federalist system that forms what I call the safety net of Article 5, where 1, 2, 3 of those checks, and each one of those groups have many checks of the process. Almost all of them can fail. If only one of them holds, then that prevents anything from happening that would not be what we want. That's why 100% of the peer-reviewed research, literally 100%, I've read as far as I can tell just about everything, says that there is no risk that a new Article 5 convention call could possibly lead to an amendment on any other topic. And the last thing before we get to that video, you can see me testifying. On my left is Mike Mineta and Jeff Clements in Massachusetts. And you always got to keep your eyes, though, on your motivation. On the right there, that's Hannah and Ginny. Wolf-PAC is going to turn 10 years old next month, and Hannah and Ginny will turn 10 years old 6 weeks later. And they are still the reasons why I do this. I'm going to play a video for you now, and while I do, make sure to leave any questions that you have in the chat on Facebook or on Zoom if you're on the Zoom, and we'll address them right after. Thanks.
I'm Jake Uger.
I'm Jake Uger.
Of the Young Turks.
Of the Young Turks.
I have an announcement.
I have an announcement.
Tonight.
Tonight.
We're going to start a fight.
Start a fight.
To take back. Our democracy.
Our democracy.
In Vermont, we were told that it was impossible in the Senate side by an ally of ours who meant well. She just said you don't have enough senators on the Democratic side to be able to push everything through committee, let alone win on the Senate floor. But actually, we did win on the Senate floor, and it was because volunteers from all across the country called in to constituents in Vermont, which then called their state reps and senators. Again, really hard work, but they did that hard work and it worked. And on the Senate side, it passed 25-2. And that's what was called impossible before. In fact, it was overwhelming, right? Now, dramatic news. It has just passed the Vermont House. First state on the board.
This resolution, I believe, is actually just pushing us forward into the opportunity to continue to voice our opinions as Americans when our own government is faulty.
Our committee asks you to join us in taking this bold step. And yes, I do think this country listens to Vermont, little Vermont. I was here when we passed civil unions. The proudest moment of my life in this body. And look now, civil unions, that's passé. Vermont does lead, and they do listen to us.
Close to 70 Wolf-PAC volunteers showed up there and said, we're here to tell you that the citizens of California want to get money out of politics. The senator who was in charge of that committee said at the end, after over 60 people testified in favor, is there anyone who dares to oppose this resolution? Okay, apparently there wasn't. It passed 5-2. Now, today, it goes to the full Senate. State number 2, 23-11. Two down, 32 to go. No. Tell me it's impossible again. Oh, I love to hear. Let me tell you how this happened in California. And by the way, California, just the largest state in the union. That's all. Okay, and we're just getting warmed up. Sudden, we put up Vermont on the board, which literally someone told us that was involved in Vermont politics was, quote, impossible, right? So all of a sudden, we had our brave little state of Vermont who stepped up to the plate as they usually do, and they said, that's okay, you can't get a big state. And all of a sudden, we put California up on the board, and that was state number 2. I believe that's a fairly large state. Now, we're on to the state of Illinois. I've told you a couple of things about them. Now, remember, we already had the resolution calling for the convention passed in the Senate in Illinois. So did we get it? Boom, 72-40 by the skin of our teeth. But guess what? The third state to call for a convention. Here comes the great state of Illinois. We're going to Vermont. We're going to California. We're going to Illinois. Oh, wear me out, man. Let me say all 34 states on one show. Look at that map. I remember when that map didn't have any shining states. Now we have 3 that are on the board.
So any effort to overturn Citizens United is one that I feel I must support. I would prefer the federal Congress to decide to offer an amendment through the states that would overturn Citizens United. They don't seem likely to do it at this point, but it is fair to say that in the past, many times when a proposal like this reaches a critical number of states supporting it, Congress wakes up, smells the coffee, and does the right thing.
Here we go again. Now, Wolf-PAC has, of course, taken it upon itself to get us a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics so that we can end the system of corruption and legalized bribery that we have and get free and fair elections. Wouldn't that be amazing if our representatives represented us? So we were, of course, told that this was impossible, but we got Vermont on the board, and then they said, yeah, it's a small state. Then we got California on the board. That's a fairly large state. They said, okay, but you only have 2 on the coast, so then we got Illinois. And then we were told, oh, well, that's okay. You did that in last year, but this year you're not going to get any further, except last year we got it introduced in 10 states. This year we've got it introduced in 19 states. And what's going on there? That looks like New Jersey is on the graphic there. Well, let's go to the voting in New Jersey on our resolution. Now, it's already passed the Senate. Now it's in the Assembly. Let's see how that voting goes. Or do we get more yeses than nos? I believe that is another state on the board. That is state number 4. They said it couldn't be done. Yet we keep rolling throughout the country. I want to show you a video of the historic moment in New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, SCR 132 has received 44 votes in the affirmative, 25 in the negative, and 2 abstentions.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 132 having received 44 votes in the affirmative, 25 votes in the negative, and 2 abstentions.
That man presiding there is the
passed.
current
Let the
senator
resolution take the usual course of past resolutions. Back on consent, bill in the clerk's desk.
So 4 states have already done it.
I'm sorry, that was
and
one
now
state,
we were in Rhode Island, and I told you recently that the House had passed the resolution.
State in America.
It was HR 7670, and it passed 59-12. It was overwhelming, and I praised a lot of those legislators. I'm going to praise them again in a second. But look, you need both houses. You don't need the governors, but you do need a House and you need the Senate in each state. And sometimes we've gotten very close in some states, gotten one of the chambers and not the other. In Rhode Island, we then, at the end of last week, went to the Senate. And the Senate bill number was SR 2581. And the vote was 36 yes, 0 no. Rhode Island is your 5th state. 5th state to come on board. We did it. We did it in Rhode Island. Because remember what Senator Joshua Miller said. There's no clapping from the audience. We can't have it. Look at what happens instead here. The first senator you're going to see is James Sheehan, and then you'll see all the others are later. Watch.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to commend my colleague, Senator Miller, on this very important issue.
We're moving, unfortunately, ever increasingly in a direction of, instead of having elections, they're becoming auctions. And I think we need to address this very serious situation. And I thank all those who came up and demonstrated. It does make a difference, and I encourage you to stay involved.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to second this resolution. I want to commend those hardworking individuals up in the gallery. Those are the same individuals that have been here with us for many months and have holding those yellow signs for the last 3 days. And again, I commend you for your hard work, both here in the Senate and on the House.
And I too join Senator Miller and all our colleagues, but especially to the advocates that have been here day in and day out. The Wolf-PAC is a movement that is going throughout the country, and I congratulate them for their efforts in getting involved, especially many of you who, for the first time, showed up, and now you're seeing how you're making a difference. So stay involved, and I hope everything goes well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As chairman of the Special Legislation Committee, I know these individuals very well. They've been here for the last couple of years testifying. They've always been very professional. They've done an outstanding job of presenting their case.
36 in the affirmative, none in the negative. The item passes. Congratulations upstairs. Senate.
The senators applauded their constituents. I have literally never seen that in my life, in all these decades of covering politics. We've got 30,000 volunteers, grassroots volunteers all across the country, and then they activate other volunteers within their states. And they work so hard. You think this happened overnight? You think this was just the one thing they showed up one day or 1 week? No, those guys, those volunteers on the ground have been working for 2 years straight. We didn't pass last year. We passed this year. We didn't get discouraged by, we didn't have instant gratification. No, we redoubled our efforts.
Justin, you were there. How did that feel?
I was extremely emotional. The last 2 years has been like really difficult. I put a lot on the line for this. Many of us put a lot on the line for this. You know, we have folks who work, you know, Greg, Big Swag, he's a father to newborn, but anytime we needed him at the State House, he would be there. And, you know, I have a girlfriend, he has a wife, and it's hard to say, hey, do you mind if we just take a couple hours and we'll be at the State House to get this up and going. But that was a very surreal moment. We put our hearts and soul into this movement, and to see the fruit of our labor just really make it a reality. It was just a really wonderful moment. But I mean, watching that, I got goosebumps.
Belinda DePina, Vera Dunno, Joe Gomez, Mike Lamptey, Nikki Morris, Cameron Ramsey, Sam Newland, Matt Mazzola. In your state, your name could be on that list. And this list lives forever.
All right, thank you. So I got a couple of questions here that I've seen so far. The first one, I'm going to take these out of order. The first, buried in the whereas section is a criticism of Citizens United, but simply reversing Citizens United would not eliminate the buying of elections. It would not affect the pernicious evils of corporate personhood. For all the hard work going into this, what specifically is the goal beyond just swatting away Citizens United? So the text of the resolution in that whereas clause says, where is it? The issues raised by the decision of Citizens United and related cases and events and desires, and related cases and events. The reason why we worded it that way is because, you know, this goes back to Buckley v. Vallejo and a number of cases from then on up to Citizens United, and then going past Citizens United as well. I mentioned American Tradition Partnership. Just a few weeks ago, there was a case, Americans for Prosperity Foundation v. Bonta, that devastated the ability to get disclosure laws passed. So, you know, and there's a case out in Alaska right now that is probably going to do some real damage in individual campaign finance limits and individual donation limits for campaigns. So these issues come up in a number of cases, and that's meant to be an indicator of what the scope of the problem is, along with the other language in the whereas. And that's consistent with the way these convention calls generally have been handling that all the way back to 1788 when the first one was issued. And the Supreme Court looks to that history when deciding how to do the interpretation. There was another question that's then related. What exactly is the proposed amendment supposed to say and accomplish? Free and fair elections sounds nice, but it's so general that to me it's meaningless. Move On's proposed amendment has two specific demands. Money is not speech and corporations are not people. I can't find any text for SF 390 or HF 729. So what's the goal there? Minnesota actually, before Wolf-PAC ever got involved in the state, did propose an Article 5 convention call with specific wording to overturn Citizens United. It was, I believe it was the very first one introduced by any state in the country. I'm not 100% sure if it was the first introduced, but it was among a few that were introduced before we got involved. The problem, I actually watched the debate that they had in Minnesota on that, and the debate was entirely about the language. When ultimately the state, according to most scholars, the state doesn't get to write the exact language. Article 5 divides the process of amending the Constitution into three parts. There's the determination stage, where either Congress or the states determine that there is a problem. That's what we're trying to do here with through the states, through the Article 5 Convention resolutions. Then there's the writing phase, where either Congress, having determined that there is a problem, writes the amendment, or where the states, having determined that there is a problem, sends delegates to a convention that they then control, that writes the amendment. That's the process that the states have to go through. And that's what nearly every scholar that has studied this says has to be done. Now, I do still understand that vagueness has been a problem. We've tried to do what we can in the resolutions with the text that I read and other texts about free and fair elections to demonstrate the purpose. There is, Wolf-PAC is going through an internal restructuring right now that was inspired by the convention process, because we do thoroughly trust that process. And we're looking at a lot of those questions right now. And that's a question that's that we're discussing internally right now is, should we have a set of guidelines or something that's a little bit more specific? As long as it's still consistent with the language that we have before, we could potentially be a little bit more specific in what exactly should those guidelines be. We can't have specific text though. We do know under Article 5 that the text has to be written before it's sent back to the states, even before it's sent to, if the convention writes it, it gets written before it's even sent to Congress. So from that point on, there is no opportunity to change anything. When I had that debate with the ACLU, they talked about creeping policy changes. The way the amendment process works, that is not a possibility because the language is set before it gets sent to Congress. Congress looks at it, says, does this follow the demands that were created by the states or not? There could be litigation over that where the courts could get involved. It then goes to the states where the states then ratify or don't. And throughout that entire process, the language cannot change anymore. So, the real big danger is failure. There's no danger of anything getting into the Constitution that we wouldn't want. Those are the only two questions I saw, but did anybody else see questions that? I see, okay. I know that historically the Senate will step in and propose an amendment given a successful Article 5 convention campaign, but if we do end up having to hold an Article 5 convention, what are some likely outcomes of such an amendment, and what steps come after the amendment is ratified? Oh yeah, that's a good point I want to make first and foremost, is this entire process, Wolf-PAC is basically all about taking step one. Getting the amendment is is the beginning of this process. That does not remove the need for great work that Our Revolution is doing, that Represent Us is doing, that lots of other groups are doing, to have it would free them up to, instead of worrying about trying to get the best laws that they can within the restrictions that the Supreme Court is putting in place, they could actually try to get the best laws put in place that would address the issue of money in politics. And that's basically the outcome that I expect to happen. I expect the handcuffs that have been placed by the Supreme Court to be removed. And what we've seen historically is once that happens, that allows for a process that is frustratingly slow, but successful over time to slowly fix the system. We saw McCain-Feingold pass. That was far from a perfect bill, but it was a big move in the right direction. And that was what was directly overturned by Citizens United. We saw other Corrupt Practices Acts and other campaign finance systems throughout the years. What I expect to happen is a case that an amendment that overturns those things that are hamstringing us. American Promise has proposed language that I particularly like, but it's ultimately not up to me to write that. Someone sees a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself and say it.
I am seeing none, Sam, none on social media as well. You did such an amazing job with your presentation. All questions are answered.
If you want to see some of the primary sources, like those videos of Scalia and Tribe, you can go to wolf-pac.com/Scalia, wolf-pac.com/Tribe. You can take a random guess at another last name that may or may not exist as well. And wolf-pac.com/resources has a very small selection of the many excellent peer-reviewed sources that go from the beginning of our country up through today, from top scholars.
And we can definitely send those links out through the follow-up email that we'll send after the event today too, so everyone can take a look at that. But if there's no more questions, we're approaching our 4 o'clock time that we said this event would be over. Thank you everyone for being here again. And thank you to everyone that made this event happen. Some special names that I want to shout out. Gabe and Ryan and Lily and Angie, who didn't speak today, but they're all integral in making this event happen, getting us in contact with Sam and Josh at Wolf-PAC National. John Shen as well, who wasn't able to be here today. He's someone who also works with Wolf-PAC National, who also got us into contact with these two so that they could be here today. Lily put together the program today. She's always our rock in getting through these events. So thank you so much. And yeah, it took a lot to get here, but it's amazing that we were able to have this event today. So again, thank you all for being here today. We will send up a follow-up email with all the resources. And yeah, I don't have anything else. If anyone else has anything to add real quick before we go, feel free. But if not, enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
I just look forward to working with Wolf-PAC again. It's been a very good experience. And I really love the presentations. Really good.
For sure. We look forward to working with Wolf-PAC in the future.
It's an honor to work with you all, an honor to be here
working with
today.
you guys.
Let's get out there and do the work.
Yeah.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.